The man suddenly vomited a large amount of strange liquid. The instruments showed that the radiation levels had reached a terrifying 133. The people nearby were terrified and quickly turned to look at the sky. A large amount of nuclear-contaminated dust was rapidly approaching. People instantly became panicked, running frantically like zombies. Meanwhile, the supermarket was in chaos, with food and water being snatched up. Traffic had completely collapsed, as everyone wanted to flee the country before the nuclear radiation arrived. But this only caused more panic, and even doctors abandoned their patients and fled. This disaster was actually caused by a combination of nature and human actions. Not long ago, countless rats suddenly emerged from the city sewers and then all jumped into the sea to commit suicide. The next day, an earthquake occurred. The news reported that it was only a magnitude 6.1 quake, so no one took it seriously. But Jay, a worker at the nuclear power plant, sensed something was wrong. He urged his co-workers to leave quickly, but they thought he was overreacting. In fact, disaster had already struck. The valve of the nuclear reactor suddenly cracked, and a large amount of nuclear coolant leaked out. Originally, replacing the valve in time could have prevented the nuclear leak, but the congressmen worried that the exposure of the incident would affect their votes, so they decided to keep it a secret. They also ordered the nuclear power plant to keep it confidential from the workers, so the nuclear power plant hastily called in a few repairmen to weld the valve. But to save trouble, the repairmen simply shut off the valve. This caused the pressure in the pipe to overload instantly. The plant manager immediately realized something was wrong. At this point, the nuclear reactor had already started melting, and the nuclear fuel was generating a large amount of hydrogen gas under high temperature. If the gas was not vented quickly, the entire reactor would explode. But at this critical moment, the congressmen were more concerned about their votes, fearing that national panic would affect the election. So they deceived the president by saying that nearby residents had been evacuated and that the problem would soon be resolved. In fact, they only evacuated a small nearby village and claimed it was a fire drill. At this point, panic spread through the nuclear power plant. Jay and his colleagues planned to evacuate urgently, only to find that the only escape route had been ordered locked by the government. Helpless, Jay had to pry open the electrical box and shut down the control system. Then he forcefully turned the valve. Just as hope for escape appeared, it was already too late. When Jay woke up, the surroundings were like a living hell. His former friends had turned into cold corpses. He suppressed his grief and began to dig through the rubble to save people. Eventually, Jay and a few injured people supported each other as they walked out of the nuclear power plant. But because they were closest to the reactor, they suffered the most severe radiation exposure. They were isolated as contamination sources. The ward was filled with tragic screams, and even painkillers couldn't alleviate their suffering. Doctors could only use cold water to cool them down, but the effect was minimal. The evacuated people finally learned the truth. They didn't want to wait here to die, but heavily armed police had surrounded the area, treating these people as contamination sources. At night, firefighters set up ladders around the nuclear power plant. They planned to cool the reactor with water to prevent a secondary explosion. But the plant manager noticed that several fire trucks were leaving. The firefighters said they were going to fetch water from a freshwater reservoir. The manager rushed into the command room and questioned the person in charge about why they didn't use seawater to cool the reactor, as the sea was nearby. But the person in charge said it was an order from the higher-ups. Using seawater would render the entire reactor unusable.
이 바닥에 폐를 녹자는 게 말이 돼! 원자로 한기가 얼마짜리인지 모르세요? 잘못되면 소장님이 책임지실 겁니까? 그래, 내가 책임진다!
The manager ordered the rescue team to use seawater to cool the reactor immediately, but the firefighters said their superiors also forbade them from using seawater. The manager suddenly realized that those officials only cared about their own interests. In their eyes, the lives of ordinary people were insignificant. Soon, the firefighters couldn't withstand the radiation anymore. People kept fainting and vomiting, with countless casualties. Meanwhile, the news of the nuclear leak could no longer be concealed. The entire South Korean populace knew about the disaster, and millions of people fell into panic. They flooded into train stations and airports, desperately trying to escape. Supermarkets were ransacked for medicine, food, and other essentials, and city traffic was completely paralyzed. Hospitals were in chaos, with even doctors abandoning their patients to flee, except for one young nurse who chose to stay and help. The South Korean president finally understood the severity of the situation and ordered the rescue teams to use seawater to cool the reactor. However, a greater crisis emerged. The spent fuel storage pool next to the reactor had developed cracks, and the coolant water was leaking continuously. If the large amount of nuclear waste stored inside came into contact with the air, it would cause a catastrophic explosion equivalent to 2 atomic bombs. At that point, all of South Korea would be doomed. The police guarding the quarantine zone began to secretly withdraw, but they refused to let the people leave before they left. The furious people worked together to topple the Iron Gate, then hijacked several buses and fled quickly. But as soon as they got on the highway, they found the road blocked and had to continue on foot. By this time, the water level in the spent fuel storage pool was nearing the warning line. The only remedy was to send someone into the nuclear power plant to repair the cracks. But no one could survive in such a high radiation environment. Desperate, the president publicly apologized and pleaded with the workers who had just escaped death to return to the nuclear power plant to repair the cracks. The workers were furious. It was clear that the malfeasance of government officials caused this disaster, but the officials are alive and well, and we are dying. Now they wanted to accelerate our deaths. But after calming down, Jay realized one thing.
지금 우리 가족들이 거리에 내팽개치지가 있습니다. 빌어먹을 방사능은 멀리 가는데 차가 움직이지 못한답니다. 그래가 맨발로 걸어가고 있다 합니다.
If the nuclear power plant exploded, the workers' families would also be in grave danger. One worker asked the nurse how long he could live. The nurse, unable to answer this cruel question, walked away silently. Since our deaths are inevitable, why not create hope for our living families before we die? The workers were reluctant to sacrifice their lives for such a country and government. But at this moment, they decided to die to save their loved ones. Soon, all the workers donned thick protective suits. But in such high radiation, the suits were merely psychological comfort. Each person received a bottle of painkillers to make their deaths less painful. The workers lined up to enter the nuclear power plant, and all the rescue personnel bowed their heads in respect for these heroes. Jay silently turned around and looked up at the sky, knowing this was the last time. The manager divided the workers into 3 groups to take turns repairing the cracks, but the radiation levels inside were too high, and people were collapsing every minute. As one group fell, the next group immediately took over their work, just as the repairs were nearly complete. More cracks suddenly appeared. A large amount of highly radioactive coolant gushed out, and they failed. Upon hearing this news, the president fell into despair. Everything was beyond redemption. As the workers were about to evacuate, Jay suddenly proposed an idea. Since the cracks couldn't be repaired, why not blow up the ceiling and turn the room below into a new cooling pool? Time was running out, and they had to weld the room's exit shut while installing the explosives. This meant one person would stay behind forever. Among them, only Jay knew how to handle explosives. While everyone hesitated, Jay had already made up his mind. Before leaving, he asked his co-worker if he would go to heaven after he died, but the only response he got was crying.
네, 먼저 갑니다. 천천히 들어오이소.
As the iron door closed, Jay began to install the explosives. His co-workers, holding back their grief, sealed him into this tomb. After finishing the installation, Jay swallowed all the remaining painkillers, but they had little effect. At this moment, death seemed like a relief to him, but the manager asked him to hold on a little longer, as the door seams hadn't been fully welded yet. Jay struggled to pick up his phone to look at his family's photos one last time, but his fingers were already unresponsive. Using his last bit of strength, Jay aimed the camera at himself and began to say his final goodbyes to his family.
엄마, 내 딸. 말 안 하고 아가 미안하고 먼저 가가 미안하고 인사도 이래 해가 미안하고 모든 게 다 미안다. 속상해하지 마라. 내 먼저 가가 아버지랑 형님이랑 잘 챙기고 있을 테니까. 라고 행수네. 형님도 없는데 우리 엄마 잘 챙겨주고 억수로 고맙다고. 이 말이 꼭 하고 싶었는데 고맙습니다. 억수로 고맙습니다. 민재 잘 키워주이소.
엄마야, 어디 가는데? 우리 자꾸 어디 가는데?
연주야, 내 승난나. 약속 안 지키가 삐겠나? 그러지 마라. 내도 너랑 단 하루라도 같이 살아보고 그게 맘대로 안 된다. 네 호강시켜준다고 한 약속도 못 지키고 오래오래 같이 살자고 한 약속도 못 지키고 진짜로 잘해준다고 했니? 진짜로 행복하게 잘 살고 싶었는데 와 그게 안 되냐. 그게 뭐 그래 대단한 욕심이라고. 와 이제 죽어야 되노. 내가 뭘 됐다고. 내가 뭘 잘못했다고. 나 이래 죽기 싫다.
우리 재영이 불쌍해서 웃잖아.
내 잊지 말고 기억해주라. 그러면 내 입에 죽어도 안 억울하게. 강제하게 파일 아니었다. 그래 기억해주라.
He didn't want to be a hero, and he was afraid of death, but he had no choice for the sake of his family. Meanwhile, his co-workers finished welding and reluctantly left the nuclear power plant. Jay pressed the detonation button, laying to rest forever in this giant tomb. His family was heartbroken, and his friends mourned him, yet the officials only pretended to show some sadness. They only remembered the loss of a nuclear power plant, not the hero who saved them. The president called the manager to inquire about the situation on site.
그 친구는 어떻게 됐습니까? 못 나왔습니다. 대통령님, 그 친구가 아니라 강제혁입니다. 강제혁, 기억하겠습니다. 꼭 기억하겠습니다.
Soon after, everyone involved in the rescue died from radiation exposure. The president personally hosted a memorial service for the fallen heroes. But no matter how they tried to make amends, the scars left in people's hearts would never heal. Here, we pay tribute to every ordinary yet great hero.
무섭다고 눈 감지 말고 겁난다고 귀 막지 마라. 우리는 판도라의 상자를 열어보는 기다. 그 안에 재앙도 불행도 있지만 희망도 있다 안 하나. 우리는 그 희망을 찾아내야 하는 기라. 우리 아들을 위해가